process works when we look in particular at Roark's thought about buildings and how Roark designs buildings. And I want to kind of zoom into this area of Roark's life, which is the central area of his life, comment on how he thinks about building, which we learn quite a lot about in The Fountainhead, right? And then we'll kind of zoom back out to the place of thinking about building in his life. It's no accident that this is his career that we're focused on here. And we'll talk a bit about the role of career in life and the relationship between that and valuing. And those are the topics I want to cover for today. And in doing that, I'm going to, at points, move beyond The Fountainhead to Atlas Shrugged. Okay, let's start with Roark's first extended discussion of this in his talking to the dean. What does he do? He criticizes the Parthenon. What's wrong with the Parthenon? It's the Parthenon, says the dean. The Parthenon. Yeah. The famous flutings on the famous columns. What are they for? To hide the joints in the wood when columns were made of wood. Only these aren't. They're marble. The triglyphs, what are they? Wood. Wooden beams, the way they had to be laid when people began to build wooden shacks. Your Greeks took marble and they made copies of their wooden structures out of it because others had done it that way. Then your masters of the Renaissance came along and made copies in plaster, of copies in marble, of copies in wood. Now here we are making copies in steel and concrete, etc. The famous flutings, what are they for? To hide the joints in the wood when columns were made of wood, only these aren't. What are they for? What are they a means to? They're a means to a certain end, which end is no longer relevant in this case. So why are you going on with flutings? We have a kind of reversal of means and ends. They're taking the means out of the context in which it makes sense. These flutings were selected by the first people who made flutings for a reason. They had a goal. The flutings were a means to achieve that goal. But now we just go about building flutings even though that context, those reasons aren't there. The flutings aren't being selected in the right way. Well, how should one select things? No two materials are alike. No two sites on Earth are alike. No two buildings have the same purpose. The purpose, the site, and the material determine the shape. So in architecture, there are certain factors. Everything about the building, the shape of it, and we'll later see all the details of the buildings, are to be determined with reference to those factors. In many buildings, they're not. Rather, they're copied, taken over from other people. So what's happening? Instead of performing this act of selecting the features that the building is to have by some standards in some ways that are appropriate to architecture, you default on doing that, and instead you rely on the selection that other people did sometime in the past, which people had to have standards by which they could select, like we need to hide these joints, so let's put up some flutings. Actually, interestingly, we have columns that serve no purpose. Okay, continuing, I'm reading now the quotes on page 7 from Roark. The beauty of the human body is that it hasn't a single muscle which doesn't serve its purpose. There is no line wasted, that every detail of it fits one idea. The idea of man and of the life of man. Will you tell me why, when it comes to a building, you don't want it to look like it had any sense or purpose? You want it to look like a hybrid beast, etc. Why? You must tell me, because I've never been able to understand it. There's something senseless about most buildings. And this is a theme that you get throughout The Fountainhead, and you get these wonderful descriptions. Dominique is particularly a master at this, of, in case you get tired of looking out at the rumps of marble cupids and so forth, just, kind of going on and on about ridiculous features on buildings for no reason, and there's something senseless and incoherent about it. But not with good buildings and not with living things. How is a good building built? Well, consider the Austin Heller House. Every piece of it is there because the house needs it, and for no other reason. You see it from here as it is inside. The rooms which you'll live in made the shape. The relation of the masses were determined by the distribution of the shape within. The ornament was determined by the method of construction, an emphasis of the principle which makes it stand. You can see each stress, each support that meets it. Your eyes go through a structural process when you look at the house. You can follow each step. You see it rise. You know what made it and why it stands. There's something coherent and sensible about it. And what is that? Well, you can see in looking at the house, there are intelligible, to someone who knows how to look for them and can see them, reasons why the house is as it is, why the details are as they are. Nothing can be reasonable or beautiful unless it's made by one central idea, and the idea sets every detail. Do you know what constitutes an integrating principle? A thought. The one thought, the single thought that created the thing in every part of it. So what do we have in all of these examples here of Roark talking about architecture? What makes some architecture good? You have selection by a standard involved. Everything is means to at some end. All of the details are selected with means to the end. But also, and here's a new point to add, there's a kind of integration of all the details around a single end. There's an idea that serves as an integrating principle, and one selects all the details in accordance with that. So if we put this together with what we saw, what he begins to say to the dean about the purpose, the site, and the material determine the shape, and we bring in some other language that one finds a lot in the Fountainhead, I think you can summarize Roark's thinking about architecture in the following way. There are such things as architectural problems. You'll recall we're often seeing Roark struggling with a problem. This was a difficult problem, how to build the Heller house or whatever the problem might be. And an architectural problem is defined by a site, a purpose, and a material. So the idea is, build a school in a certain area, purpose, site, out of certain materials. Here's an actual example of an architectural problem we get in the Fountainhead. To design a decent, this is actually a quote, to design a decent modern unit that could rent for $15 a month, close quote, purpose, in Astoria, Queens, site, with the materials available in 1935. What problem is that? The problem of designing Cortlandt homes, right, which only Roark is able to solve. Okay, how does he solve it? He projects a single idea, a central idea. Which idea is a solution to that problem? And then everything else about the house, every detail of the house, is set in accordance with that idea. What is the central idea? 6 concrete buildings, 15 stories high, each made in the shape of an irregular star with triangular arms, containing modular apartments prefabricated and with prefabricated plastic and light metal components, extending from a central shaft containing elevators, stairways, and utilities. That's the central idea of Cortlandt homes. I got that by taking a quote and then inserting a couple of things that occur within a sentence or two that elaborate on it. And we can see how everything else about Cortlandt homes is set in accordance with that idea. So what are some of the details? Again, the central idea, 6 concrete buildings. So we're going to have several buildings. They're going to be a certain height. And they're each going to be, and this is the important part, in the shape of an irregular star with arms which contain modular apartments with prefabricated plastic and light metal components extending from a central shaft, which is going to contain all the utilities and elevators. Okay, details. The ceilings were precast. Okay, prefabricated, cheaper. If you need to replace things, you can easily replace them, right? The inner walls were of plastic tiles. All the pipes and wires were laid down in metal ducts at the edge of the floors. Why at the edge of the floors? You don't have to tear up the floors to get to them. They're right by the central shaft where all the utilities are emanating from, right? Without costly demolition. The kitchens and bathrooms are prefabricated, inner partitions, and you can read on. There's more said about Cortlandt homes, and you can see how this is how it works. And you can see, too, if you read back into the other architectural problems, why the Heller house, the Emtright house, you can just go through any of them and you can come up to, with yourself, what the problem is and what the central idea is, only with a certain degree of resolution, because after all, these aren't real places, and this isn't, there wasn't an actual architect who solved this problem. It's fictional, so you can only go into as much detail as the novel gives you, but there's enough to get the idea that this is what's happening. So what Roark does is he forms a central idea, and then he selects things in accordance with it. That idea serves as a standard for determining what goes into the building. Now, what's interesting about this, and this becomes very clear in Roark's speech, and I think it's also very clear in The Fountainhead, is that these central ideas are things that we have to conceive of. They're new. And this is the real contrast between the creator and the second-hander. The second-hander adapts something he already knows about. He takes something over and kind of figures out how to meet his current needs with it. But the creator conceives of some new idea, which he conceives of in solution to a certain problem. And then he sets everything in accordance with the standards of that idea. And I think that's a really important idea for Ayn Rand that one finds throughout Atlas and The Fountainhead. Particularly one finds it in Atlas, where it really gets stressed. The mind, but also in Roark's speech, the mind that thought of this for the first time. So I'm going to pause here because I've kind of preempted questions, and we've kind of gotten out a pretty big swath of material. So I want to talk, just questions on what we've had so far, and then we'll kind of pick up and go on, developing this idea of architectural